Good morning and welcome to Biopower in Transition, Prisons and Policing During the Long Soviet Collapse. My name is Faith Hillis and I teach history at the University of Chicago. And today's panel is part of a year-long project sponsored by the Neubauer Collegium that I am very happily undertaking with my colleague Leah Feldman from the Comparative Literature Department. Through 5 interdisciplinary panels taking place over the course of the year, we aim to reassess the meanings and consequences of the Soviet collapse on its 30th anniversary. This is the second of 5 meetings, and for information about future events, please consult our project page on the Neubauer website. This morning, we have an exciting program featuring 4 speakers. We've asked them each to strictly stick to a 15-minute limit to leave time for discussion at the end that will be moderated by Leah Feldman. Over the course of their presentations, we urge you to submit questions for the panelists or for the panelists as a group via the Q&A tab. I'll now introduce our first speaker this morning, who is Anya Eisman. Anya is an assistant professor and postdoctoral scholar at the Michigan Society of Fellows. Her current book project is entitled From Tolstoy to Pussy Riot, Anarchist Currents in Russian Culture. Based on archival research and oral histories with artists, writers, and activists, it finds missing links between the 19th century anarchist movements, Soviet underground cultures, and contemporary collectives. Anya is also at work on a second project on contemporary theater in Russia and has translated plays by several contemporary Russian authors. We'll now welcome Anya Eisman.
Hi, thank you so much. So I will share my presentation. Okay. So this talk, as mentioned, is part of a broader project on anarchist currents in Russian culture, and it's focused on contemporary art. And my presentation is going to be significantly enhanced by the images. So if you are able to look at the screen, I think this listening to me will be much more rewarding that way. Okay. So in August 2019, the artist and self-described anarchist Artyom Loskutov bought a billy club from a retired officer of the Russian National Guard, applied the colors of the Russian flag to it like toothpaste to a toothbrush, and smacked a blank canvas. He announced the invention of a new style of painting called dubinopis, a term that recalls the Russian word for icon painting and literally means billy club writing. The early billy club paintings were a reaction to the repression of large protests in Moscow of 2019, during which police officers brutally beat and mass arrested students, minors, and produced hundreds of images of Russian police brutality. Loskutov's dubinopis took the tool of police violence out of context and repurposed it for art making, warning that the police too create images and that they're being interpreted. And Loskutov's dubinopis joins a rather illustrious genealogy of Russian artists using the tools and images of the police. This artistic genealogy is constantly evolving and hypercritical. So there are a few factors that set the newest artists, these young artists, including Artyom Loskutov, apart from their teachers in anti-police art. First of all, these new artists eschew authoritarian self-representation. So while playing the policeman, they use various forms of critical framing without reenacting violence, as for instance was done in practices such as these. This is a 2011 action by Vaina, the performance art group Vaina, where performers forcibly kissed police women. So this kind of practice is rejected, and they also reject the invitation of violence, as in this famous mid-1990s action by Oleg Kulik. And so the newest artists criticize their artistic predecessors, the actionists and the conceptualists of the late Soviet era, late and post-Soviet era. They charge that the self-aggrandizement of the actionists, their sort of self-portrayal as sages or martyrs or outcasts, conceals their authoritarian personality as art, leading to belated painful revelations, as for instance here in Piotr Pawlensky's horrific domestic violence case. And they charge that the playfulness of the conceptualists, as well the vagueness of their politics, left them open for co-optation, as indeed they were co-opted in the 90s in politically slippery art projects such as the National Bolshevik Party, and indeed this co-optation continues today. So here a US white supremacist leader praises the sort of artistic and political project of the 90s, this National Bolshevik Party that started out as a project of several conceptualist artists and philosophers. And so to avoid this, the contemporary artists that I will talk about today announced their political position and used social media to invite mass solidarity rather than sort of hanging out in exclusively in sort of small spaces where all kinds of things are not up for public scrutiny. So these new artists are responding to their actionist and conceptualist teachers, authorities of the performance art canon, as part of a collective process of depolicing. They have to view not only the police critically, but also the role of art and having sort of made certain things and certain politics palatable by playing with signifiers. I'll give a more extended example. We'll take a very famous recent action by Pussy Riot, their pitch invasion in the 2018 World Cup final match. This action is called The Policeman Enters the Game, and it was seen by millions of people watching the World Cup on TV and by 17 heads of state, including Putin, present at the game. So Pussy Riot members dressed in police uniforms and managed to pass through security and run onto the field during the final match, France versus Croatia, provoking a kind of slapstick chase comedy where the pretend cops are running around the field and they're being chased by referees and security and players. And in a video released simultaneously with this pitch invasion action, the three female artists are reading a statement. So the statement concludes with familiar demands for the release of political prisoners, an end to police fabrication of lawsuits against the regime's detractors, but it also calls for the decidedly absurdist, quote, transformation of the earthly policeman into the heavenly policeman. And it cautions that the heavenly policeman, quote unquote, is watching the earthly policeman break the heavenly rules of the game. So now what is this? What is this language about? So in this video, you can see balancing on the arm of the couch, the latest editions of works by the late Soviet conceptualist and performance artist, Dmitry Prigov. And this entire action and the theme of the heavenly and earthly policeman is an homage to Prigov's poetic cycle on the militsioner. It's a sort of misspelled like officer or policeman or something like that. Prigov began performing as the militsioner in the artistic underground of the late 1970s, wearing a militia cap and reciting poetry in what kind of sounds like the tone of a pedantic and sort of ridiculous, out of touch Soviet school teacher. And in Prigov's poems, they're kind of like hilarious spoofs of traditional lyric poetry. The militsioner emerges as this larger than life figure that sees, judges, and vanquishes all. And so it's an absolutely perfect tautology spun out of bits of Soviet discourse, citations and quotes. And he's sort of portrayed as this origin of order and the leveler of chaos to emptiness. He is actually a direct reference in the reworking of a figure from Soviet children's books called Uncle Styopa the Policeman, a sort of larger than life hero that was a staple of many Soviet generations of Soviet childhoods and even post-Soviet ones, including mine. So Prigov's militsioner, to go back to him, is this perfect emblem of the of the time of the Brezhnev stagnation era, where Soviet or even early Soviet symbols are constantly reproduced, and they remain for generations. And the Pussy Riot's reworking of this is only one of the many references in contemporary art to the figure of the policeman, of the militsaner. So here you see a still from a video game recently released, also thematizing this militsaner figure. Now, Prigov in his time counted on the his own countercultural status in this late Soviet underground to provide his listeners with a critical frame alongside the sort of mere pleasure of laughing at recognizable Soviet signifiers, everybody collectively making fun of them. But Prigov actually admits himself that policemen have enjoyed his work. And he declares that he was extremely attracted to hyper-saturated ideological and cliche discourses. Here's a quote from him. "I'm inclined to, quote, disappear in large bodies and practices. I don't have a passion to rationalize them, extracting from them any knowledge and relating to it magically. I relate to them in the opposite way. I test their ultimate capacity to be articulated. I don't believe that one can extract anything real from social practice." So Pussy Riot members follow Prigov's example in playing the policeman and even adopting his visual language, but by tying their performance to explicit demands and by framing it through clowning and slapstick chase comedy rather than kind of neutral over citation, they unequivocally state their opposition to the regime and even accuse its language and imagery of being violent. I'll give another brief example. The Party of the Dead performance art group, this is a contemporary group, they borrow images from 1980s necro-realist cinema to talk about state violence, but they refuse to reenact violence, which is a core element of the late Soviet necro-realist aesthetic. And likewise, the graffiti, this is another example, a graffiti artist who makes a mural called Potsuluy, Kiss It, using the sort of colors of the Russian OMON, the Russian SWAT uniforms. And he's citing a 1990 mural of a well-known photograph of a kiss that Leonid Brezhnev shares with GDR leader Erich Honecker. So here's a kiss, and then here is this imperative to kiss. But the young artist of this mural is dispensing with the homophobic and ageist disgust invoked by the original mural and equated by that original with a sort of critical gaze. So contemporary artists have adapted the tools used by their Brezhnev era teachers to expose the hypocrisy of policing, while at the same time, they reject the untenable politics of these predecessors. And these references to the Brezhnev era, the stagnation, are also a response to similarities in policing styles between the Brezhnev era and the Putin era. Putin learns from the Brezhnev era the importance of preemptive policing, of repressing dissent to control domestic and international perception. Censorship is exercised creatively here via event permits, rental agreements, by seeking far-right militias against opposition groups, and of course, more contemporary sort of case, via lawsuits. And it must be remembered that the figure of Putin itself, in the figure of Putin itself, the police, or rather the secret police, becomes the highest authority of the land, right? Putin is a former KGB officer, and he is this kind of Uncle Styopa, the policeman and the militsaner. So here, for instance, in honoring the author of the Uncle Styopa sort of stories, Putin admits that he was, quote unquote, raised by Uncle Styopa, the policeman. In a memorable comment in 1999 on the day of the Russia celebrating the Russian secret police, Putin jokes, "I would like to report," he says this is a quote, report that the group of FSB officers dispatched to work secretly in the federal government has been successful in its first set of assignments. So in reality, as Tony Wood argues in Russia Without Putin, Putin's secret police methods of blackmail and compromising information, as well as manipulation of the legal system and consistent use of the threatened or actual violence were widely practiced in Russia throughout the post-Soviet, throughout the late and post-Soviet period. And Putin had been a good student of those practices. Now, the standard narrative about Putin's popularity has a sort of break between the Brezhnev era of the 80s and Putin's rise to power and the eventual stagnation of his regimes. There is that kind of lawlessness, right, and chaos of the 90s that supposedly Putin deals with successfully, which makes him so popular. And the Putin administration would have us look at a series of law enforcement reforms that it conducts as part of this stabilization of the regime. For example, in 2003, the administration calls for the persecution of quote unquote werewolves in epaulets or corrupt police. And in what follows, over 700 Moscow policemen are revealed to have participated in organized crime, which, as we know, is this enormous problem, social problem in Russia in the 90s. But critics actually allege that this initiative and many other anti-corruption initiatives like that were merely pre-election publicity stunts. And they argue that actually, statistically speaking, trust in the police remained low throughout the 2000s, and that crime didn't even decrease, contrary to the sort of dominant narrative. And so that disconnect between people's actual experience of policing in the 2000s as a continuation of the lawless 90s, so to speak, and the ideological myth created by the Putin administration of everything stabilizing and coming to order produced an several speculative fictions that are actually an additional enormously important context for the anti-police art that I've shown you today. And so it kind of bridges for us that, gap between the 80s actionists and conceptualists and the contemporary artists who are critiquing them. So I'll give two examples of these speculative policing fictions. Here is Victor Pelevin's 2004 novel, The Sacred Book of the Werewolf, which features fantastical FSB agents who use their magical powers to serve the fatherland. In one salient scene, they gather to howl at the moon in order to unlock an oil well. And despite this their sort of fealty to corruption and petrocapitalism, the FSB werewolves are these devout and humble Christians in this novel. Oh, I'm sorry. Here we go. That's the Sacred Book of the Werewolf. And then the other one, which I've already revealed to you, is Vladimir Sarokin's Day of the Apricnik. This is the name of the police in the time of Ivan the Terrible, the Aprichniki. So this novel likewise imagines the mystical rituals of government agents, and it depicts how, following the Grey Trouble, Tsarism is restored in the year 2028. The Aprichniki conduct government business through rape and murder while performing Orthodox Christian devotion and loyalty to the Tsar. And they wear Russian peasant dress and speak in a mix of contemporary prison jargon and medieval Russian. And Pelevin and Sarokin have been important influences for the artists I've discussed. So I briefly showed you an action by the Rodina Art Group already, though I didn't refer to it as such, but happy to come back to it. Here's another one of their pieces, a tribute to Sarokin. And then here is a tribute by the aforementioned Vaina art group, where they board up the Apricnik restaurant, a sort of luxury restaurant in Moscow known to entertain all kinds of policing elites. However, my most recent artists ultimately come to reject Sarokin and Pelevin on the grounds that they're too politically ambivalent, too playful, and too enamored of state violence. And on the grounds that they can be co-opted by the quote unquote werewolves in epaulets themselves. Indeed, reactionary artists learn well from Sarokin and Pilevin's worlds of sort of state violence. Here is the graphic artist Alexandra Zheleznova. She has a multi-year graphic novel project called The Darkest Hour. It's about the petrostate of Nordland, a Gothic, it's somehow also, so sort of slightly like medieval Christian empire. Whereas in Sarokin's novel, government bureaucrats combine folk culture with the sort of capitalist moral decay. Their task is to save Lady Oil, the Guinevere of Nordland, and the bureaucrats are actually sort of consciously modeled on these images of bureaucrats are consciously modeled on Russian Orthodox icons in digital paintings. And Zheleznova actually gives each one of her characters her own face because she herself is a passionate government bureaucrat. She considers her ambitions to ascend government bureaucracy the source of her creativity. And although her book is not directly related to policing, her protagonist, Mr. Eisen, is actually himself a crime fighter. Like Pilevin's characters, Mr. Eisen is a shapeshifter. He turns into a psoglav or doghead from Slavic folklore. So I have tried to show you in this last example how the speculative fictions of the 2000s both provided a lot of fertile imagery for art, and yet also ultimately came to be rejected by artists who today who have had this kind of slew of artistic references to choose from and have felt the imperative to state outright their oppositional politics instead of playing with Soviet and late Soviet and post-Soviet images. And I guess for me, the sort of perfect encapsulation of this is this video from the Pussy Riot's Policeman Enters the Game action, their pitch invasion, where you can see the enormously influential Prigov contained to the books perched on the couch, and the women themselves making a powerful political statement using and sort of scrambling his artistic language and symbols. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anya. Our next speaker is going to be Elliot Borenstein. Elliot is Professor of Russian and Slavic Studies and Senior Academic Convener for the Global Network at New York University. He is the author of Men Without Women, Masculinity and Revolution in Russian Fiction, 1917 to 29, Overkill, Sex and Violence in Contemporary Russian Popular Culture, Plots Against Russia, Conspiracy and Fantasy After Socialism, and the hot off the presses Pussy Riot, Speaking Punk to Power.
Thank you. And all right, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this. And as you'll see, I have some overlap with Anya's presentation, but I think that should be productive more than anything. Also, I have no PowerPoint to share because I think I'm a bit PowerPointed out after 9 months of Zoom, so bear with me. So while I have never been one for field work, it does occur to me that I have had several encounters with the post-Soviet police. Fortunately, they were all in the 1990s, when the stakes for such incidents were relatively low. Now I see that when I was sitting in a Moscow militia van in 1999, after failing to produce documents 100 feet from the rented apartment I was in, I should have anticipated that 21 years later, my need for data could have been satisfied if I had just asked the right questions. To be fair though, if I could go back in time and warn myself that today's online event was coming, the younger me would probably have just asked quizzically, what the hell is Zoom? Before going back to painstakingly downloading the 3rd season finale of Buffy the Vampire Slayer using my GlassNet account and a 56K modem. Instead, I just passed the time giving unsatisfactory answers to inquiries about my background until the cop finally asked straight out if I was Jewish. This had nothing to do with any legal jeopardy I might have been in, and admitting to being Jewish would not have gotten me into any trouble. Quite the contrary. I was usually stopped by police in their ongoing attempts to round up suspicious people of Caucasian nationality. Do you ever stop blondes? I asked once, but only after brandishing my boss-level immunity in the form of the magic American passport that I neglected to carry the day of the police van incident. The Jewish question, to coin a phrase, was more a matter of satisfying a mutual if inconsequential need, his to peg my ethnicity and mine to make him say it. After most likely missing several hints about possible bribes, I was let go with a stern warning to carry my passport with me at all times. All of which is to say that in interacting with the post-Soviet militia, I never was quite sure what sort of institution I was dealing with. Were they supposed to be stopping crime, or were they the Russian equivalent of ICE, keeping the city safe from the threat of undocumented black hair? Besides doing a poor job of ethnic profiling, they really could have learned a lot from their much more efficiently racist counterparts in the US, and despite doing an even worse job at catching criminals, if the news was any indication, what were they really for? The generous invitation to take part in a panel on prisons and policing initially filled me with an anxiety comparable to being asked for my identity documents when I've left them at home. Clearly, there's been a breakdown in profiling. But my speaking time today is roughly equivalent to the time I spent in the van. I survived that, so I assume I can survive this. So here are my thoughts, such as they are. Policing and prison seem like an obvious pairing, like love and marriage, if only from a cynical post-divorce point of view. But in terms of their symbolic resonance for the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia, they are not equal partners. As portrayed by critics and dissidents, the Soviet prison camp system was the country's master metaphor. The USSR was one vast carceral zone, but with less freedom of speech. It worked well with the American Cold War metaphor of the Soviet Union as a penitentiary for captive nations. I bring these ideas up not to endorse them. The portion of non-incarcerated Soviet population that saw themselves as prisoners was probably minuscule. The power of these metaphors did not reside in their empirical accuracy, but in their rhetorical force. From an oppositional point of view, they made intuitive sense. But that metaphorical power rested on the dissidents' familiar distinction between the political criminal and the real criminal. Well before the Soviet Union ended, a romantic subculture surrounding the thieves' prison life made its way outside the zone, particularly in the form of the Blatnaya Pyesnya, the thieves' song. By the 1990s, prison became the source of important segments of popular culture, providing slang, serving as the setting for various flavors of criminal melodrama, and inspiring fashions and behaviors among the gopniki, and a rough analog to the prison hip-hop connection. It was only in the shift from medium to high Putinism that prison started once again to make inroads into the public political consciousness, thanks to high-profile cases, Khodorkovsky, Magnitsky, Pussy Riot. The post-Pussy Riot Media Zona project is important not just for the obvious reason, activism on behalf of the incarcerated, but also for the sheer linguistic novelty of putting these two words together, media and zone. As for their other activist endeavor, Zona Prava, zone of law, the irony I think speaks for itself. The path of the police from the late Soviet to the post-Soviet is more complicated. I would like to put forward the proposition that the police as police occupied only a small corner of the country's psychic real estate, despite the significance of, say, Dядя Степа. The USSR was relatively short on police, but long on policing. Technically, of course, there were no police, but rather the militia. The term initially signaled a break with the Tsarist-era police and carried a whiff of spontaneous self-organization, even if that whiff was deceptive. Favoring a military-style hierarchy to a greater extent than its Western counterparts, the militia exemplified the Soviet tendency to turn the military into the template for an unofficial table of ranks. You get to be a general, and you get to be a general. Everyone gets to be a general. In the technical absence of the police, the USSR had hypertrophied police functions, shared not only by those very same military and militarized bodies, including but not limited to the KGB, but also party structures, enterprises, and medical authorities. The fight against crime, as we would understand the word, was never the cornerstone. If statistics have even minimal validity, crime was not a significant widespread problem, or at least not framed as such. I still remember my first year of Russian textbook learning the phrase, "У нас в Советском Союзе не крадут," as something that people would say to you. Instead, these institutions police the borders of the behaviorally and ideologically permissible. Crossing certain lines led to serious policing of the violators, but by bodies that were not technically police. It was not that all cops were bastards, but that all bastards were, in some way or another, cops. Some, but not all of this changes after 1991. As crime becomes central to the news, it also colonizes popular entertainment. A perceived boom in robbers yields a similar growth in cops. The popularity of crime genre was already apparent in Soviet times, but kept under wraps by limited publication and scant imports of foreign crime film and fiction, and the ideological strictures that limited the ability to represent crime as a homemade phenomenon. Actual cops, that is militiamen, become heroes and anti-heroes from the early days of Menты, улицы разбитых фонарей, that is cops, broken streetlights, down to the more recent major, inexplicably plucked out of the Russian linguistic ghetto by Netflix and renamed Silver Spoon. At the same time, the militia, now police, are more recognizable as a problem. It is the various divisions of the police, or MVD, who are responsible for arresting and beating protesters, for example. The police are now more appropriate as a symbol of state repression, but they still do not have a monopoly on policing. Those same repressive functions exercised by schools, enterprises, and medical establishments still have a policing role. In the case of the first two, it is they who are still responsible for mobilizing their constituencies to vote correctly, for example, while medical experts continue to be called upon to declare or try to declare inconvenient people unfit. If this all sounds Foucauldian, I apologize, because I intended for it to be more along the lines of Foucault adjacent, maybe sort of a Foucaultiness. These institutions do not constitute power knowledge, but rather enforce it. In other words, they police. As for the police militia themselves, post-Soviet conditions require a level of visibility from them that was not as necessary under late socialism. The police, and particularly OMON, the Russian equivalent of SWAT, are deployed not just operationally, but operatically, that is, performatively. With a dynamic weirdly inverted later by Pussy Riot, their masked anonymity and displays of overwhelming superior force help constitute the Putinist paradigm of strength and order. And technically, the Russian police, even when local, are the ground level instantiation of a federal authority serving within the MVD, the Ministry of Internal Affairs. In the state imaginary, federal authority replicates itself anywhere and everywhere, a structure that is as much fractal as it is hierarchical. The police function as both a symbol of state biopower and its most immediate physical manifestation. Their bodies are sacred and untouchable in a way that those of ordinary citizens are not. Think of the Bolotnaya trial, where no officer got in trouble for beating protesters, but protesters were prosecuted for the equivalent of hurting the cops' fists with their faces. In such an unequal contest between differently valued and empowered bodies, what kind of resistance is available? To address this question, I want to end my talk by bringing in actionism, and in particular the collective known as Vaina. The immediate audience for most of Vaina's actions in the Medvedev years, that is the feast in the subway car, the cats thrown at McDonald's cashiers, and so on, the immediate audience are the bystanders. That is, this is art that leverages physical presence and emphasizes the use of bodies in space, as they certainly did during the biological museum orgy. The second, much larger audience is on the internet. Most of what they did would have been local and ephemeral without video uploads. But there is a third audience whose role is undeniable, even if that audience is not always physically present: law enforcement. Law enforcement, or put more simply, the police, are always a potential restraint on their activities. In fact, I would argue that the police play the same role of productive restriction as meter and rhyme do for traditional poetry. Nearly all of Vaina's performances took place within short time frames limited by the inevitable arrival of the police. Either the police's arrival was part of the act, or successful action relied on the complementary distribution of actionist bodies and police bodies. It all worked out as long as they weren't in the same place at the same time. Vaina's last action, which now looks like a transitional pupal stage between the larva of Vaina and the butterfly of Pussy Riot, exposes the dangers in conflating the police as symbol and the police as body, and this is a definite overlap with Anya's presentation. Commemorating the new law transforming the militia into the police, Kiss the Pig consisted of female members of Vaina, including Nadia Tolokonnikova and Katya Samutsevich, two future Pussy Riot trial defendants. It consisted of them surprising female cops and kissing them on the lips without permission. Though Tolokonnikova said she wanted men involved, this was really the only arrangement unlikely to end in serious physical violence. Women kissing male cops could not be sure of getting away safely, men kissing female cops would be arrested for assault, and men kissing male cops would be lucky to escape with their lives. Faced with the obvious and, in my opinion, entirely valid criticism that what she and her colleagues were doing was a kind of sexual assault, Tolokonnikova responds that when a person puts on a cop's uniform, they stop being a person and become only a cop. In other words, she sees the symbolic cop as overriding the physical cop. Cops, like kings, have two bodies, but for the purposes of the action, only one of them really matters. The physical body is exploited as a weakness in the symbolic cop body. In a way, this is a brilliant reductio ad absurdum of the symbolic prominence that the police have attained under high Putinism. But it also means assenting to that very logic and deploying personal biological power in the cause of the negation of state biopower. This is a conundrum that cannot be solved even by performance art. It is a losing proposition, transforming the political protester into something akin to an actual criminal, thereby validating the state's framework. When I was working on my Pussy Riot book, this was the only moment when I was truly disappointed in Tolokonnikova. For the most part, actionists and the 2012 protesters had avoided the trap of binary Manichaean thinking that caught so many Soviet-era dissidents who, in their crusade for freedom, developed an ideologically rigid maximalism and became the mirror image of the regime they despised. The demonstrators and actionists sidestepped this trap through absurdity, but also came close to the bodily self-sacrifice of the nonviolence of Gandhi and King. The final irony is that the actionist who seemed to literally embody this ethos was Pyotr Pavliensky, notorious for, among other things, nailing his own scrotum to the cobblestones of Red Square, often reported as nailing his testicles, but I want to stress how completely different this is. But now, his former partner, Oksana Shaligina, has written a book detailing the sadistic abuse she suffered at his hands. Shaligina ends her interview with Wonderzine with a statement that says it all. Он был искренним в своей борьбе, но был такой же властью, как и та, против которой боролся. He was sincere in his struggle, but he was the same repressive authority as the one he fought against. Power, authority, the law, they're like quicksand. The more you fight, the more you are sucked in. Or in the words of Sonny Curtis and the Crickets, I fought the law and the law won. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elliot. And as we're now at the halfway point of our presentations, I just want to remind the audience to feel free to use the Q&A function to submit their questions. Our next speaker is Yana Skorobogatov. Yana is a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union, an assistant professor of history at Williams College. She is currently completing her first book manuscript, tentatively titled The Inferno, The Death Penalty at the End of the Soviet Imagination. And this is a history of the death penalty and death penalty abolition in Russia and the Soviet Union. Welcome to Yana.
Thank you so much, Faith. And thank you everyone for coming. Like 49 people right now, it's pretty amazing. I'm going to share my screen with a slide for the beginning very briefly, and then I'm going to exit and then return to slides. So if you could just bear with me, I'm going to share my screen right now. I'm going to begin first with this, the title of an article by George Packer that came out in The Atlantic in June 2020. We all don't really need a reminder about what the summer of 2020 brought for us, but if in case you do, it's the summer of COVID, the summer of America's reckoning with police brutality, among many other things, and race. The title of the article read, "We are living in a failed state. The coronavirus didn't break America. It revealed what was already broken." And as I was reading this article, and here I will, well, I'll leave it on for a second. As I was reading the article and I came across the title, I was in the midst of working on a chapter from my book on the death penalty that featured many kind of Soviet citizens' complaints about police transgressions, including violence, but really police illegality, police abuses of power. And when I was reading this, I recall vividly reading this one article, I decided to kind of play with the title a bit and see if it worked for my own interests. So I decided to replace the title with, "They were living in a failed state. Complaints of police transgressions didn't break the Soviet Union. They revealed what was already broken." So again, at the time, I was writing about ultimately a failed state, the Soviet Union, at the same time as people were talking about failed states in the United States. So I was really kind of in the midst of working through these ideas. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And of course, I'm unable to do that. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now. And so I recall very vividly when Faith and Leah wrote to me and asked if I wanted to present on the topic of prisons and police in its relationship to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I remember writing back within like 5 minutes, like, yes, absolutely. I was exactly kind of thinking about these terms, these themes in my own work at the time. So I'll give you all a sense of where I'm coming from, what the book that I'm writing and how it relates to this topic of police transgressions and how they appeared in complaints in death penalty cases in particular. So I'm interested, the manuscript in progress that I'm working on is a history of the death penalty and death penalty abolition in Russia and the Soviet Union. And the main thrust of my book centers on approximately 105 death penalty case files. And these cases were tried between 1954 and 1991. Almost all of the cases that I examine are from the greater Moscow region, so Moskovsky Oblast. And I do, though, include in the book death penalty cases from outside of Moscow, but still within Soviet Russia. And in my book, I really make a concerted effort to prune the records that these death penalty cases left behind. And I pay particular attention to the language that people who found themselves facing the prospect of death in the hands of the Soviet state, the language that they leveraged during this exceptional and emotionally loaded moment in their lives. And specifically, my book covers the 1954 to 1991 period. I'm really interested in how that language changed over time. And for the purposes of our discussion, I'm interested in how what that language looked like on the eve of what ends up being the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. One of the main sources that my book focuses on, that I rely on my research, were trial transcripts. So quite literally transcribed trial transcripts of death penalty cases that were transcribed in real time by court secretaries, and that captured the dialogue and some of the things that were said during these very exceptional moments in people's lives and these exceptional criminal cases. The transcripts themselves are enormous. They often go up to about 200 handwritten pages. There's lots of dialogue. They're very rich. One part of the transcript, so there's a lot to work with. I had, I had so many options to kind of, what do I want to focus on in these approximately 105 trial transcripts that I work with? What to focus on. There's so much you can look at. And one thing that really interested me about these trial transcripts was this one part of them where defendants, the person on trial for death penalty eligible crimes, was had the right to provide their final word, their last words to the court. So at the end of a trial, after the defendant, the person who's on trial for a death penalty eligible offense, when they were at the end of trial, once they heard that the local prosecutor was recommending death for them, they were given the chance to say something, to offer their final words to the court. And these would end up being the last words that the judge would hear. And so in my head, I was like, well, this is really interesting. These people are given the last opportunity to speak to the people in the audience, and there were audiences at these trials. They were given the chance to, perhaps offer, apologize for what they did, to pray. Oftentimes in the United States, people, when given their chance to offer their final words, they ask God for forgiveness. They leverage religious sentiments, religious language. So that was really interesting. What did people in the Soviet Union, given their last chance to speak to society, to the public, to the state, what did they say? And I take quite seriously the specific context of this moment. Again, this is their last chance to testify, to offer their testimony. People who have studied the emotional context and what people are going through psychologically, mentally, emotionally during when they're living on death row, when they're facing the prospect of death. Many people do show how they are a combination of, they become very lucid, but also very desperate. And Brian Stevenson, who many people here might have read, Brian Stevenson, who is a death penalty lawyer, in his memoir, Just Mercy, he describes at one stage how he was talking to somebody who was a condemned person, knew that they would be executed by, in this case, the American state. He recalled that, I'd never heard voices so desperate. So there's this kind of desperation, in some ways, possibly kind of an openness and an honesty and a truth, a bearing of the soul that's taking place during these moments that I apply to and trying to understand and contextualize the environment that people who are speaking, giving their last words in court, what they're going through. So this is kind of the context around which that I'm looking at these final words. I'm now going to share my screen and to give you a sense of some of the final words. And quite literally, you'll see what some of the final words that people who were put on trial in the late 1980s, several years, a couple years before the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union, you'll see what these final words are. And one of the, such a remarkable and consistent theme that comes up in these final words was the condemnation of police malfeasance, of police violations, of improper conduct in the hands of the police. There was something that, it was an undeniably commonly appearing theme in my research and kind of in the various final words that I examined as part of my this chapter. So I'm going to share my screen and give you a sense of some of the words that people gave. So I'll turn first to the case of one condemned man named Nikolai Cerullov, who in 1987 was on trial for murder in this case. And in his final words, when asked to provide his final words, he gave a very long address, and I just have an excerpt from that for you today. So he says, "I'm not going to get away with it, and I'm not going to ask for leniency, but the criminal investigation was conducted poorly. The investigator forced me to confess to committing premeditated murder with the promise that if I did so, they would reclassify my crime as negligent homicide. I don't deny my guilt, and I don't want to walk away from taking responsibility for that." Excuse me, typo. "What I deserve and what I ask for is for my sentence to be fair." So here, Cerullov is in some ways whistleblowing, kind of alerting the court that, by the way, this is happening. Forced confessions are these common tactics that the police are engaging in and trying to kind of trick their way out into solving and finding culprits for various cases. So again, this is something that he is bringing up, not just in some ordinary complaint or some letter to the court. No, he is using his last chance in court to alert the public to this one kind of very common thing that comes up in letters and in these court cases is the prevalence of forced confessions. A second example, this one from 1986, from a man named Anatoly Prashlakov, who also was on trial for murder. He writes how, "You have all heard the testimony I gave to the investigators at the time of my arrest. This testimony was mine and mine alone. I came up with it myself. In that testimony, I offered the names of those people who try to force me to give a false testimony." So again, this Anatoly Prashlakov is using his last moments in front of his audience to tell them that I was put in a position to lie. I had to resist the people who are authorities in our society, the criminal investigators who were oftentimes really just police officers. They try to force me to lie, but I gave the truth, and the testimony I gave was mine and mine alone. So there's this attempt to separate oneself, to portray oneself as being a source of truth in a sea of lies. And I want to give a sense also of just how these accusations of police injustices and police malfeasance went beyond just the words of the condemned. And I have an excerpt from a letter that the mother of a man who was on death row wrote to a court, in which she too talked about and condemned in her letter the actions of the police involved in her case. This is from 1989. It was a woman named Tamara Zakirova. She writes, "In the 30 minutes that I spent with my son," so she goes to her, she actually visits her son on death row, "I learned that my son was jailed for 20 days, 10 of which he spent in solitary confinement, allegedly for resisting the police," which is not true. "The police officers who arrested him did everything they could to force him to plead guilty to everything he was being accused of, and forced him to take the blame for another unsolved case." So again, the mother of a man on death row is using her final chance to possibly request for mercy, to achieve what she wanted, the outcome that she wanted, which was for her son to be freed from death row, or most likely just having a sentence commuted to a long-term prison sentence. Rather than asking for forgiveness from the state, rather than talking about how good her son was, she felt that it was extremely important to talk about police malfeasance, police brutality, the illegal measures that, or not illegal, but measures that she believed were kind of inappropriate and unjust that were taken against her son. So I'm going to stop sharing. So thinking about kind of going back to the George Packer quote beginning of my talk, I wanted to just kind of end with thinking about what the fact that people were talking about police brutality and police violence in their last words and their kind of last moments of speaking to the Soviet state at the end of the Soviet state's own existence. What does it tell us about the collapse? So what does it tell us that during the final years of the Soviet Union, people were using their final words to talk about police violence? So at the very least, it shows how people in late Soviet subjects, citizens of the late Soviet Union, even on the eve of the collapse of the Soviet Union, were not atomized people. These were people who were not checked out of society. They were not all across the board looking inwards, ignoring, the spectacle, the kind of the ridiculousness of what was taking place in Soviet society and mainstream Soviet society. I'm thinking in particular about the work of Alexei Yurchak and how he examines how elites in Leningrad particularly were checking out of mainstream political culture and kind of institutional life. This is not the case, at least in the subjects, the people that I look at for my own book. You're seeing actually a great deal of involvement and thinking about Soviet institutions in very critical ways, and in some ways kind of reform-minded ways. I'm wondering also, though, and aside from the fact that this shows us how late Soviet subjects were not these atomized individuals, I do kind of wonder what the rise of police talk, how can we use this as evidence, or possibly as evidence of the demise of other forms of talk? In my book, I trace, when I examine the 1950s, the 1960s, I show how people, instead of talking about rule breaking, law breaking, police violence, people are really talking about in the earlier period about, I was a good soldier, I served in the war, my family is a good worker, I have a great Soviet biography, that's why I deserve to have my life saved. What does it tell us that on the eve of the Soviet Union's collapse, people, instead of looking within on their own selves, are looking outside and the corrupt world outside as a source to justify why they deserve a second chance of life? And so in the same way that talk of police brutality and talk of police violence in the summer of 2020 in the United States suggested the demise of the American state, of a failed American state, perhaps something similar can be said about the talk of police violence and law breaking, and as evidence of a coming failed state of the Soviet Union. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our final speaker this morning is Christina Vatolescu. Christina is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at New York University. Her book, Police Aesthetics, Literature, Film, and the Secret Police, a study of the relationships between cultural and policing practices in 20th century Eastern Europe, won the Help Prize for the Outstanding Academic Title and the Outstanding Academic Title Award sponsored by Choice. She is the editor and, the co-editor of the Svetlana Boym Reader and a Perspectives on Europe special issue on secrecy. Christina is currently completing a book entitled Illegible Archives: The Challenges of Rereading an Archival Revolution. Welcome, Christina.
Sorry. Thank you, Faith, and thank you, Leah and Jessica, for organizing and for inviting me, and thank you all for coming in to listen. It's really great to see so many participants today. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, can you see my presentation? Yes. Okay, I hope so. So today I'm going to take you to the margins of post-Soviet space. But before we go there, we'll start from the same place that Jana just started us off in the presentation before, which is the summer of 2020 and going into the fall, into the present moment in the US. So, and the question of police brutality. So, okay, here we go. A prison is a trap for catching time. The basic reality of American prisons is not that of the lock and key, but that of the lock and the clock. This is how Adam Gopnik began and ended the first paragraph of his 2011 Caging of America. He ends the article itself by quoting King Lear. Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Take physic, Palm. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel. This, Gopnik concludes, changes. Prisons are our this. We need take more care. In the body of the article, Gopnik gives us a lucid and thus heartbreaking overview of the statistics, the histories, and the theories of how and why, quote, the US is currently holding 6 million people under correctional supervision, more people than were installed in gulags. This is what you can probably see right here in the caption to the image. The validity of the comparison depends on how and if the incarcerated were counted. Historians of the Eastern Bloc have spent the past 3 decades researching and debating this count, with margins of errors ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions. What is undeniable is that no matter their stark opposition, the US and the Soviet and post-Soviet world share the plague of mass incarceration on an unprecedented scale. Gopnik makes clear that what we are missing in the US is not good reporting, which, quote, appears often about the inner life of the American prison. The catch is that American prison life is mostly undramatic. The reported stories fail to grab us because, for the most part, nothing happens. So just as we were about to relax in the usual seats of the self-righteously enraged, we find ourselves in the hot seat as readers. Gopnik tells us that of all things, it is our way of reading, our inability to be grabbed by the undramatic, to understand how nothing can amount to torture, that needs to change before we can truly take care of our this, the caging of America. So Gopnik chooses to spend his entire first page making us, his New Yorker readers, aka today's pomp, so making us take physic of the experience of prison, of the lock and the clock. He zeroes in on the tortuous distortion of time in prison, quote, no one who has ever been inside a prison, if only for a day, can ever forget the feeling. Time stops, a note of attenuated panic, of watchful paranoia, anxiety and boredom and fear mixed into a kind of enveloping fog, end of quote. We catch a glimpse of a time that one does, a time that one serves, time that is done to people against their will to the point of making them come undone. Gopnik labors under the belief that if one truly understood this experience, what could not stand it anymore, one would be moved to care. Gopnik's article does its best to produce this experience in the reader, but in keeping with the pressures of journalism, it too soon moves on to the statistics, to the literature review, to the arguments, before leaving us on that powerful reminder to take physic of what wretches feel. In Garrett Bradley's recent documentary, Time, Fox Rich, the wife of a man sentenced to 60 years in prison, memorably echoes Gopnik's diagnosis, tracing its rippling effects not only onto the prisoners, but also on their families. Quote, the system breaks you apart. It is designed, like slavery, to tear you apart. Instead of using a whip, they use mother time. End of quote. A moving recent attempt to take physic of time distorted by policing to the point of becoming a lethal weapon happened during the protests following George Floyd's murder, when protesters lay down in silence for 8 minutes and 42 seconds, the time that George Floyd was made to lie on the pavement with a police officer's knee pressed onto his neck. Of course, there's no way that the almost 9 minutes of lying down on the pavement could give a real measure of the suffering it was commemorating. It could merely point to the millions of hours of unrecorded suffering that went unheeded before George Floyd's murder. We have a long way until we understand, no less take physic of, the many ways in which policing can exert its power by distorting the experience of time. An object lesson in how policing shapes the experience of time for the policed, the policing, and also for society at large comes from Corneliu Porumboiu, a Romanian filmmaker who taps cinema's potential for, quote, making fresh a certain time of being and reacting. His award-winning Police Adjective from 2009 deeply engages with Gopnik's conundrum of representing and taking physic of the problem of the undramatic nothing of that time that can turn deadly. Yet the conundrum is set in a different time, place, and society. Attended to, these differences throw an estranging and I believe instructive light on our current situation while presenting one of the most in-depth investigations of policing in the post-Soviet transition. In Police Adjective, this certain time of being and reacting is the time of police surveillance, which often turns out to be that time. The film follows a small town policeman, Christy, here he is, as he himself follows a couple of pot-smoking high schoolers. The time is the seemingly never-ending transition limbo after the 1989 revolution, itself a murking starting point for was it or was it not a revolution? Ponders Porumboiu's debut feature from its title to its last minute, garnering a Cannes Palme d'Or, but no clear answer. You see, the translation is totally changed, right? The Romanian is, was it or was it not a revolution? And the English translation was 1208 east of Bucharest. In Police Adjective, Porumboiu's second film, still nothing much happens in real time. That is, the dead time of surveillance is filmed in cinematic time. In cinematic real time, interminable sequences with no cuts. Even the enthusiastic New Yorker reviewer admits to folding laundry and ordering wine while watching. Amateur reviewers are far more ruthless. This rhythm, defined by slowness and dead time, is the key to the character and thus to the movie. Porumboiu, the director, explains. I believe that this kind of deliberate proceedings, which take a lot of time and a lot of effort, and by changing the personality of the person who does them. End of quote. This change in the policeman is indeed the drama of the movie. Faced with the prospect of putting a child in prison for 7 years for smoking a joint, an action punished at the time by 7 years in prison, yet an action that he believes will be decriminalized once Romania joins the EU, the policeman undergoes a crisis of conscience. It is this crisis of conscience that makes him drag his feet on the investigation, thus making the painfully time-consuming surveillance work doubly time-consuming and doubly painful for himself and for many viewers. It is worth pointing out that the viewer's pain is the teenager's gain. As the investigation and the film drag on, the teenager takes more drags, known for expanding one's sense of time. He also goes to school, falls in love, roams the city, enjoying a freedom made more visible and precious to us by the hanging threat of his arrest. Christie's slowing down of the investigation is viewed as subversion by his boss, who orders him to arrest the teenager by 4 p.m. under threat of losing his job. At first, Christie, the policeman, bravely, almost unbelievably refuses. Then, under pressure, he bargains for time. A 2-week wait would bring to town and potentially to justice the true, or rather truer culprit, the older dealer through whom the teenager gets his joint. But the boss, much like the viewers and the reviewers, is sick of all this waiting. In the most famous scene of the movie, the dictionary scene, he puts an end to Christie's crisis of conscience by ordering him to search the meanings of the words conscience, law, and, in his coup de grace, policeman in the main Romanian reference dictionary, widely known by its acronym, the DEX. Much has been made of the dictionary scene that convinces the policeman to organize a sting operation that doubly captures the teenager, making him end both in prison and on screen. It's a filmed sting operation. Viewers have been quick to note the violence of language, seeing the complicity between the DEX, the dictionary, and the lex, or law, that is, it is called to define and uphold. Philology, as the murderous philologist cries in Eugene Ionescu's Bold Singer, leads to crime while pretending here to solve the crime. My close reading of the dictionary scene takes about 4 pages, so today I will ask you to trust me with the conclusion, and if you're interested, I can refer you to the full argument in the article version of this talk. My conclusion from close viewing the scene and the movie in general is that Porumboiu shows cinema to be just as, if not more, complicit in the ending as the dictionary. Not accidentally does the sting operation scene focus primarily on the filming of the arrest, with the policeman concluding. The camera gives the signal. I confirm it. Porumboiu's critiques goes beyond the complicity among mainstream literature, cinema, and media culture that collude in replaying the same stereotypes roles, to the less visible links between seemingly different ways of watching others practiced by the police and the spectating public on and off screen. This is a cinema guilty of trading in the slow pace of watching for capturing or even making up the drama, and with it, almost as collateral damage, the criminal. If this seems far-fetched, consider all the individuals wrongly put in prison after a hasty investigation, often under the public's pressure to find a culprit, preferably one that looks the part of the criminal. It is easier and more expedient than looking beyond individual scapegoats to societal failures that may reach as far as one's own cinema seat or one's own viewing position. Porumboiu's is a critique of a way of watching, of spectating that cannot stand, no less understand, the undramatic time of others' suffering, incarceration, or even freedom. Just like Gopnik's The Caging of America, the film does not allow its spectators to remain innocent. Instead, it pushes us to consider the particular experience of time and watching that we share with policing. The charge is even stronger here, not only that we fail to be compassionate in our reading, but that the cinematic equivalent of reading, watching, is deeply complicit with policing, precisely in its manhandling of undramatic dead time in a way that can turn it deadly, not just to others, as in Gopnik, but also, and here is Porumboiu's twist, it can even turn deadly to ourselves. What saves the movie from the moralistic sadism that threatens Gopnik's argument, you, reader and spectator, should sit there and suffer like the victims of society so that you feel like and with them, is Porumboiu's painfully felt awareness of the slippery slope between victims, policemen, spectators, and filmmakers. He is no master of waiting and dead time, and this is no cinematic masterclass. It's an object lesson, and the director is also its object, driven to the breaking point by the waiting, himself desiring a quicker and happier ending, just like any one of his impatient spectators. This is a quote from Porumboiu. My generation is an inadequate one, as it had absolute idealism and saw it collapse. Even after the revolution, it became more and more cynical or adapted itself to the prevailing cynicism. It seems to me that the transition Romania is passing through today is never going to end, or it is going to end too late when I won't need it anymore. Every film I've made so far has been made in the shadow of this despair. I hope I'm wrong. Here, Porumboiu sees not just himself, but his whole generation, his film subjects and his implied spectators, as wretches waiting and watching how this never-ending dead time of transition threatens to destroy them, either by reducing them to desperation or turning them into cynical sellouts. So in Porumboiu's provincial Eastern Europe, there is little pomp, but plenty of wretches. So the meaningful opposition is not between pomp and wretches, but between two meanings of wretches distinguished by the dictionary. The first one is one who is sunk in deep distress, sorrow, misfortune, and poverty, a miserable, unhappy, unfortunate person. And the second one is a vile, sorry, or despicable person. While Gopnik sees his job in American society as writing from the side of the pomp, attempting to bridge the chasm between pomp and wretches by making his New Yorker readers feel what wretches feel, the job of the transition era East European filmmaker occupying the slippery slope between the two meanings of wretch is to show just how slippery this slope is, not just for the policeman, but also for the filmmaker and for the spectators. I believe that this may possibly slow our descent from being miserable into turning vile by becoming the agents of others' misery. But this may be my westernized hubris. I suggested this possibility to Porumboiu in the Q&A following the premiere of Police Adjective at the New York Film Festival. I asked him whether, alongside his critique of a cinema that is accomplice with the police, his own cinema, slow and observant, offers an alternative, if not a solution. After a moment of silence, he responded that he did not think film can offer any solution. It can only depict the problem. His reticence is, I believe, rooted in a strong suspicion of agency, which in this film appears not just fictitious and misleading, but even criminal. This may be a trace of the dichotomy between victims and oppressors that long structures any discourse around policing in Eastern Europe, a dichotomy that Porumboiu deliberately questions when gracing his policeman with a crisis of conscience. Yet agency, in as much as it has overwhelmingly been on the side of the agents, is still too compromised. I am of the same inadequate generation as Porumboiu, same 1989 revolution, same absolute idealism, another Romanian provincial town. But when the option came down to cynicism and more waiting in the limbo of transition, I took the third way. I left. It took a while, but I thought by now I know how it's done, leaving home, no less a movie or an essay. And yet Porumboiu's movie did not let me go. It did not let me end the wait. I felt trapped in the movie, in the writing about it. And to the extent that you are still here listening, you are perhaps caught with me way beyond the usual time allotted to a think piece. My writing in the first person may well be out of place here. The movie, after all, shows that the I, as a subject, as an agent, is beside the point. Instead, the film never lets the spectator, the you, in the second person accusative case, off the hook. You may want to think that it's someone else's drama, some other wretches, some pomp. Yet this movie's lack of drama turns out to be all about you, caught on the slippery slope between two kinds of wretches. So as time goes, you stop not just hoping for a happy end, this is after all Eastern European art cinema. You stop hoping for an end at all. The movie makes even the desire for an end suspect, while painfully apparent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone for these great presentations. I'm going to invite everyone to turn their cameras back on and join us. And again, just as a reminder to the audience, we're going to have a brief moderated conversation among ourselves, but we also very much invite questions from you. So please don't be shy about submitting those via the Q&A tab. Before we go further, I'm going to introduce Leah Feldman, who's going to moderate today's discussion. Leah is Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Chicago. Her research explores the poetics and politics of global literary and cultural entanglements, as well as critical approaches to translation theory, semiotics, Marxist aesthetics, and decolonial theory. She is the author of On the Threshold of Eurasia, Orientalism and Revolutionary Aesthetics in the Caucasus. And she's currently writing on the rise of the new right in late and post-Soviet Eurasia, as well as a book tentatively entitled Feeling Collapse on Soviet film, art, and performance from Central Asia and the Caucasus amidst the collapsing sensorium of the Soviet Empire.
Thanks so much, Faith.
Do we have opportunities to ask questions now, or do you start?
Well, I would love to just hear more from you all. These were just such thought-provoking presentations. I do have one sort of question, and then maybe you all can decide if you want to take up that question or just kind of dialogue with yourselves. All these presentations kind of raised this problem for me in terms of thinking about, what is the relationship between the policing imaginary and public space, and the shifting understanding of public space during this period. And both Anya and Elliot, your presentations focused on the role of performance art, right? And the ways in which the kind of shifting publics of performance art, as Anya, you're talking about like a new kind of actionist critique of conceptualists, the previous actionist groups, or for kind of self-aggrandizement and the sort of location and the apartment art of like private space, right? And so what does it mean to kind of reinvent space in this moment, and what is the role of the police in that? And Elliot, your talk also brought a similar kind of line of thought to mind when you're thinking about the police themselves as the audience for the performance piece. And Yana also, I mean, even the kind of the scene of the courtroom, the witness of the judge, right? And then Christina, your analysis of this film and the kind of implication of the viewer, your implication of us as viewers. And I would love to hear more about how you guys see the shifting role of public space in relation to the police. I mean, is this the kind of like introduction of liberalism into the equation of policing or something else? And kind of relatedly also, particularly Elliot and Anya, I'm really interested in the role of nonviolence or the figuration of nonviolence that you're seeing in post-Soviet art, and if you could speak more to that.
I could begin and just offer some comments as the historian and maybe the one who isn't working as closely with post-Soviet sources and culture. I mean, I actually really took a lot from these presentations because it's really forcing me, like Leah, like you suggested, to think about the way that people are, that the condemned people, you know, just about to be condemned people that I'm really interested in, are in some ways also performing in the same way that many of the contemporary artists that you all are looking at for an audience in this, what is a public space. The courtroom is this public space in its own right, and the people that I'm like looking at are in some ways kind of acting like liberal subjects, but I don't really, that's not an idea that I want to expand too much upon in my own work. I find the biggest takeaway for me is that you can act like a liberal subject in an illiberal setting, and it doesn't really, and I don't really think these categories are as cordoned off and as different as we like to really think of them as being. But all to say, I really did kind of take away a great deal about the performative value that even somebody who might be in, as I described, in this very emotionally difficult, loaded circumstance, are still kind of leveraging all that they have in a performative way, possibly, and using the police as a very kind of potent target of their performance. The audience is both, it's not the police, but the audience is there to think about the police as an element of society that is maybe a source of moral decay.
I suppose I could jump in. I'm not going to address the performance part aspect of it so much because I think Anya went much further and better in that than I did. But I think what we're dealing with this question of bodies and spaces in Russia is what we're very aware of right now, of course, in the COVID moment when, you know, all of us are inside and all of that, and then we have the George Floyd protests outside. I think actually Russia gave us a glimpse of this earlier, which is that there's not so much, it's almost a dialectic really between the bodies in the streets and the need to actually have a physical body out there in the streets and a set of physical bodies, and the mediation or remediation of it on video on the internet. That is, there's a standard critique of slacktivism, right? You know, you press like on Facebook and you feel like you've done something. And what we've again seen in the States recently is that really nothing replaces having bodies out there on the street, in part as a show of numbers and in part as a declaration, I think, of a willingness to be vulnerable. But by the same token, I wouldn't want to see it as a complete and unadulterated return of the real, because as always, I mean, I know about the protests, they're happening in my neighborhood all the time, but most of us know about all these things when they're mediated and remade on the internet. So in a way, you know, we have to have the bodies in the street, but then we also have to have the bodies uploaded on video. It's sort of like the whole singularity thing where people imagine having their minds uploaded and all of that. We still need the substratum of our bodies to maintain the minds, and we need the minds, we need the bodies on the streets to produce the video that's going to mobilize everybody. So it's the kind of video cyborg experience that really just depends, still depends so much on meat space rather than, you know, just simply internet space.
Anya, do you want to jump in, or should I respond? Maybe I think your presentation is so much more connected to Elliot's that it might make sense for you to go after him.
Sure. I wanted to introduce a term that's very important for understanding the contemporary artists that I was talking about. And I think in general, contemporary activism, as opposed to even the sort of Gen X led activism and mindset maybe that I think is actually helpful for understanding the slightly older artists, but also even it strikes me as, you know, your filmmaker, Christina, as a kind of, as a Gen Xer and as somebody who's very much beholden to that, like, you know, not to stereotype, but, you know, the activism of despair that Gen Xers often kind of talk about. So this term is affirmative biopolitics, and it's for contemporary philosophers and for the activists and artists who take up this practice. As for them, it's a counter force to biopower, which of course they see as, you know, to define it in a nutshell, I guess for our use and very broadly, is the enaction of state violence, right? So if biopower is the control of bodies, often through policing or you know, medical sort of supervision or whatever it is by the state, affirmative biopolitics is the practice of creating transformation, not from above by force of the state or by capturing state power, let's say through revolution, but from below, which roughly put is through inspiration, right? So, you know, some ways it's a non-revolutionary, like a fundamentally unrevolutionary idea of social transformation, because it's about ideas spreading by the sort of through this kind of grassroots diffusion. And for artists and activists on the ground, and as I've tried to argue, for these contemporary artists, this is an indivisible, these practices are indivisible. There is no difference between being an activist and being an organizer, an artist and being an organizer. And for them, this kind of spreading social transformation through the creation of radical spaces, whether it's through art or through space for activism, a demonstration, a sit-in, whatever it is. This is all part of sort of enacting the world that they wish to see right now in this moment, even if it's temporary, right? And the idea, the temporality and spatiality are of course very important for them, obviously, because they're being physically squeezed out by increasing policing. For me, I didn't talk about this at all, but contemporary documentary theater is very much subject to this kind of policing and surveillance. They also, I think, though not all of them, but many documentary theater makers actually practice, although they don't necessarily call it that, they practice affirmative biopolitical sort of activism through the creation of these local spaces where you can process together some kind of social injustice, and you can imagine together a different world, audience and sort of performers together, but they're also constantly squeezed out from their performance spaces, from, you know, festivals, their events closed down, our artist exhibitions closed down. So it is definitely a struggle for space. There's no doubt about that. And, you know, I guess if I may sort of, and I guess what distinguishes this practice from straight up biopower is very clear, right? So they reject, as I mentioned, they reject reenaction of any kind of violence, making the spectator feel like they're being violated. This is something we may see even in their earlier work, but something that I believe they come to reject. And it's one of their departures from this previous kind of art that's proven to be very slippery and very dangerous and easy to co-opt, and also morally compromising. And I guess this is actually where I might have a provocation for Christina, maybe a question, but maybe a provocation too, is for these younger artists, activists, I mean, even scholars, like live this life today in Russia, in particular. For them, it is absolutely crucial not to create any kind of slippage between their discomfort and their experience of social injustice and what is happening to people who actually have the full force of the state upon them at all times. So whether they're migrants who are being policed, or they are people in Russian prisons today, there is no it is very important to hold those two things as separate. Our kind of experience of discomfort cannot possibly resemble, right, what people are going through. And of course, this attitude matches exactly what activists in the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, wish to stress, that we cannot just erase the category of race from this from these protests. We can't say this is about social injustice and police brutality in general. This is about the experience of a very specific group that's related to slavery, that's related to racial capitalism, right? And so I wonder, I'm sorry I'm talking for so long, I guess I wonder whether there is actually a response to this kind of Gen X filmmaking of, that seems to suggest, oh, we're all like this, we're all wretches, even as audience members sitting in this theater for 2 hours, able to walk out at any moment, we too are cast in this kind of experience of time, where a contemporary artist might say, no, this is exactly it. This is not at all like that. It is an absolutely different kind of experience. So I guess that's what I wonder. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. No, that's a wonderful question. And maybe I can answer maybe Leah's question since it was first, and then try to grapple with yours, which is a great provocation. So the question of space and biopolitics, what I was trying to get at is how a way of watching can be part of biopolitics, right? The way that we are taught to watch others and watch ourselves. And but space is a hugely important part of the movie and of this relationship that, and that kind of ties someone who is only metaphorically tied to their cinema seat, right? And passive and so on and so forth, with the policeman who's watching. So there is a parallel there. And we through him traverse this post-Soviet, space of transition, this provincial town. And it all looks the same. It's all gray. It's kind of disorienting. And in this, he seems like this flaneur, right? This kind of like post-Soviet flaneur going around the city. You don't even know what exactly he's looking for, what he's watching. It all goes forever. Whereas at the end of the movie, you realize that in fact, he's been watching in very different ways than you have been watching, because he's able to draw that map at the end where he's trapping the teenager, and he knows exactly where all the gates are and where to place the camera and how there's no escape, and so that's where you realize that your way of traversing space and watching that had been for a moment superimposed with his is very different as he switches to this, ultimate policing, capturing, hunter kind of version of space. So it's almost, I think Jana talked about this kind of like liberal subject behavior in a liberal space. It's almost the opposite, right? That he has this kind of labyrinthine space, and that at the end he makes it into a panopticon, in a way that totally leaves me behind, right? That I realize, oh, actually, I thought I was like him, but in fact, I'm not watching like him at all, you know? And I see what you're saying, Anya. I think that so much of what Forum Boyo is doing is responding to those dichotomies between, you know, victims and oppressors that had structured the you know, the 1990s, for example, and the memory of communism in Eastern Europe. And so I think that in some ways, what he's doing is turning the light onto oneself, right, as moviegoer, as movie making, so on and so forth, and also allowing the policeman a crisis of conscience. And we might want to draw clearer boundaries, but I think, you know, the Romanian New Wave, as opposed to much of, you know, the Russian contemporary art, is all about ambiguity. You know, we don't have, as in Lyubov, for example, a, you know, the heroine wearing, you know, a Mother Russia t-shirt and running on the treadmill. And it deals a lot in ambiguities and in confusions, and it might be kind of a culture. It might be that art needs to do different things in a place that, you know, in Eastern Europe versus in Russia, and that the dangers in some are being co-opted by the state and are maybe less strong, you know. So I think it might be that, I guess, the danger of demonizing others seem bigger for these Romanian artists than the danger of creating a distance from both the policeman and other victims.
Do you all have questions for one another additionally that you would like to pose? I can also read, I should also read some of these questions. Perhaps I'll turn to them. The first question, Elliot, is for you about your background choice and how you decided to choose it. The next question is for Anya. I was wondering if you thought about the artwork Kisses in connection to the famous piece by Sini and Losey and their works featuring kissing policemen that was in turn inspired by the graffiti piece capturing kissing constables produced by Banksy. Do you see the media street art graffiti with their mission of producing an intervention in the public space as being important for this particular subject, and Russian artists as participating in global trends? And then another question, thank you for the fascinating talks. I assume that policing, like any kind of state function, is not a binary business with a clear delineation between the police and the policed. My question is hence to wonder about the diachronics of policing in this period. This is a time of great changes and norms and rules during the late Soviet years and the later very deep social, political, and economic changes in the post-Soviet years. Is policing the one constant in this maelstrom of change? Or if not, how essential or superficial are the changes? What, if any, is the influence of the non-post-socialist world? Is policing in Russia these days post-socialist or global? And then the last question we have, I'm just giving these also, you have ample things to spark your thoughts. Thank you for these super interesting talks. This might be a weird question, but why do we need to emphasize the collapse of the Soviet if we can very easily say that the US is also already broken? Are all states failed states in some way, but only some called so? Some are only called so. Anyone like to start?
Well, I have the easy one, so I'll start with that. When COVID started, I just started doing a new background every day to keep myself busy and to try to inspire my colleagues to not be afraid of Zoom. So I have a collection of 30 or 40 of them, and every time I have to do something, I try to pick out a vaguely appropriate one and not repeat myself, like not wearing the same outfit twice at the same event. So this is the most police themed thing I could come up with. That's it.
Pretty much all the artists I talked about today, these contemporary folks, are anarchists. So they would absolutely agree with you that all states are failed states, or at least to them, that's how they see things. And they're localists, they're activists who believe in workers' unions and workers and cooperatives and sort of communal housing and this kind of thing. So local decision making. But to respond to a couple of the previous questions, so thank you, Tatiana, for pointing that out. That's absolutely part of the genealogy. The Signes Nazis are very important also as a springboard, like a lot of these are something to push away from and to ultimately reject, even though it had an enormous influence on these artists. And I think the second part of your question has to do again with this idea of space, the role of space and capturing it through street art, through graffiti or performance art. Yes, it's really important, and it is something that these artists share with, with a lot of contemporary art, that they would say probably that Banksy is too commercialized. That's yet another sort of authority of the artistic canon that they have had to reject as part of kind of depolicing their own mind, and somebody they've learned a lot from, but that they ultimately want to differentiate themselves from, do something different. And that it's very important for their kind of practice of liberation to say that the artistic canon and the canon of and state authority have some disturbing commonalities, where art is often able to justify or to create slippage that enables some sort of violence. And I think that they would accuse Signes Nazis of doing that, of making something so ironic that you don't see that you can, sit back and laugh instead of going out into the streets, right? Like a lot of these older artists simply don't believe in that. And discourage other artists from doing it. There's statements from Aliag Kulik, who is this kind of figure of performance art, saying that interspecies competition is much more important than cross species competition. So like the art world, everybody has to be a total individualist, competing ruthlessly for space, and that's the only way to be creative, rather than building solidarity so you can fight a common enemy, right? So yeah, I think this is a global trend. I think increasingly they all sort of are part of the same conversation, while trying to say that they respect fundamental differences. So when artists in Russia make art about discussing Black Lives Matter, something that's very important for them is never casting themselves as, similar to Black people who have this history of racialized discrimination and oppression.
I would be happy to address Juliana's comment. Hi, Juliana, good to see you, and hope you're well. Thank you for coming. I'm really interested in your question about this dichotomy, this maybe perhaps too forced of a dichotomy that I certainly exude in a bit in my presentation, between police and policed. And one of the themes that I examine in my book that I see emerge in this late socialist moment is actually a blurring in some ways in certain areas of the distinction between police and policed. I see in particular a pretty marked rise in calls for harsh justice, at least on behalf of, or coming from members of the public who, in my case, don't have a connection to the people who are being put on trial for these crimes. There's a really large call for an increase in policing and a this rising fear of crime, particularly I actually examined something that Alex Sayurchuk examines, the rise of fear of child violence against children, of serial killers, and again, serial killers who prove that, who are notorious and their long kind of careers show that, the Soviet state, the Soviet police aren't doing a good job of addressing these very, very violent acts of murder. So I do see this blurring between the two. But I still just take seriously just the rise of police rhetoric, even if it's for more policing or least policing. Like, why are people talking about policing in the late Soviet period? Whereas really, I see very little of this in the earlier, in my case, the immediate post-Stalin years that I began my book in. And I do also want to address the comment from, I think again, it was anonymous, about failed states. And yeah, I absolutely agree that certain states get to be called failed states and others don't. The Soviet Union is this kind of classic failed state. And only really recently has mainstream American discourse allowed that idea to appear on the front of The Atlantic, and authored by quite liberal authors like George Packer. But I was really interested in the summer about how even like my not super like woke mother-in-law started talking about the United States as a failed state. I'm like, why is this the time when people start talking about the US as a failed state? One can argue that people, the 2008 was a great time to talk about America as a failed state. I don't remember that rhetoric being leveraged at that time. So what is it about the language of failed stateness in the summer? What was that language? And what I saw was that it was actually quite similar to some of the language that I see in my own sources as you approach the collapse of the most prototypical failed state, the Soviet Union. So I don't try to say that like one is a better way of one is a more true descriptor than the other, that the Soviet Union was more of a failed state than America. I mean, I'm really interested in like, why do people start calling things the way they do, and how can you kind of trace continuities across time and also across regions?
There's a question for you, Christina, as well.
Yes, and I think it also, in some ways, I can answer it at the same time as Julianne's question about kind of the diachronics of policing, right? Because the police boss and the young policeman, I think, represent some of that change in policing, right? The police boss, obviously, having been educated in communist times and representing this like old way of policing, where whereas the new policeman, is given a crisis of conscience, and you can see it even in the language, which is really important in the movie, because as in Russia, the term during communism was not policeman, was militiamen, right? So the fact that now we go back to policemen, and that it's the whole question in that dictionary scene is look up the word politist, what does it mean? And he gets caught in this definition. The first definition is politist means a policeman, an agent of the police. And so that's kind of what he's looking for. But it's just such a non-answer, such a non-dramatic answer, that he goes right to the next meaning, which is not at all the meaning that he's looking for. Is the meaning for adjective, which basically means kind of detective, right? Detective, novel, or film. And there he's given this this kind of really alluring definition of this is a politiste, is a detective, a novel or film in which a policeman or a detective manages through his ingenuity to solve a puzzle and to solve a crime and bring a criminal to justice, right? And I think what happens there, this is how the old boss catches this new kind of like proto-liberal subject with the temptation, with the trap of agency. that, you know, in this movie, he's given the agency to solve a crime. He's been basically a slacker. He's been moving around, you know, the city and you know, watching people in real time, doing nothing. He's about to be kicked out of his job. And suddenly the dictionary gives him this totally fictitious sense of, you know, having the agency of solving a crime. And he takes that. So in some ways, I think that, yes, this film, at least, is a lot about those changes and what they take. And I would, to go back to Anya and her provocation, I would argue that it takes more than running into a stadium and this kind of actions that, as Elliot, I think, put it, they have to be short, right? Because the timing of it always presupposes for the police to come. This is more about a way of living for decades and decades, that, you know, things that never end. So yeah, I think that there is a lot of change, and that the old policeman boss is very good at using kind of liberal, you know, buzzwords like agency to catch the new policeman to do the job that he wants to do.
Can I go back to the failed state thing again? Because I want to give a kind of,
Yeah.
I want to give a kind of crotchety grandpa response, which is that I think the idea that all failed states is rhetorically wonderful, but politically meaningless, in that it fits in with something that really frustrates me so much in some progressive discourse, because I'm part of it, which is this desire to collapse everything bad into its worst case example. So, you know, silence is violence, rhetorical violence is as bad as physical violence. No, I'd rather someone were rhetorically violent with me than beat the crap out of me. And I'd rather, and yes, all states have a failing element to them, but there's something significant about a state that actually collapses in terms of official statehood and becomes 15 different statelets. And I just feel that this is something that we, and I'm including myself in this, do that can make us feel good, but is really counterproductive. It's like in 2016 saying Hillary and Trump are basically the same. They're both neoliberals. Well, yes, but one of them ends up putting kids in cages. So I really want to preserve distinction rather than collapse distinction, and perhaps see failed states on a continuum of failing. But to say all states are failed states is I think ultimately then to say nothing about states.
I mean, I think too, if I can interject or just add one other kind of term here, I mean, I think we could think of it also as like a failing. There is a certain failing of a kind of liberal international order that is, you know, like in a Gramscian mode, right? That is the catalyst for a lot of like this discussion of violence and this sort of like the emergence of the morbid, right? But like, but I mean that is also the linchpin of that claim, right? That like Hillary and Trump are the same, right? This kind of like exhaustion of like the failure of liberalism, right? Which is different than talking about the failure of a state in particular. But we might think about what the implications of that are on like modes of policing and modes of visualizing policing.
Right, but denying the distinction among those is actually from a position of privilege, because you don't have to really worry about the extreme case, and you can assume it as being like, you know, the moderately bad.
Wait, could you say more?
So like the Hillary Trump thing, right? You know,
Yeah.
it's easy to be comfortable saying you're the same if you're not directly suffering from the policies of the worst one, right? So I think there's a kind of, I think it comes from a place of comfort to collapse everything into one bad thing rather than a place of discomfort.
I do find it interesting, though, that the people who seem to be the most vocal proponents of talking about, one needs to vote for Trump rather than Hillary, are the ones who would never have their kids in cages.
Right, exactly.
Like George Packer talking about failed state, he's never going to suffer the consequences of a failed state. He'll move to where his bank account is and across in Europe. So.
But totally, I mean, this is the line of the new right, which is like a victimized, white male position, right? Which is talking about like the ways in which the state, the calling for the collapse of the state as a move toward the creation of neo-fascism, right? So it's absolutely from the right, I don't even think it's like a position position of privilege. I think it's just like absolutely from the right, you know.
It's Leninist though. It's чем хуже, тем лучше.
So I think the example of the kids in cages is actually really unfortunate here, because that is actually a matter of continuity, of like extreme continuity, and even absurdly, because we do start paying more attention to it under Trump than under Obama, but in fact, under Obama, more deportations happened, like a lot more, right? And this is something that's very important for the people who think that the answer to the long haul that Christina, you were talking about, you know, the long haul is despair, right? And then there are actions, you know, sparks, movements or something. But between that, what do you do to keep, you know, what can you do to keep from totally getting sort of lost? The answer for in the left, in the artistic left, is to organize, right? You have to be an organizer. You can't just do a cool action and then walk away. You also have to be an eco-activist. You have to do the stuff in between that's hard and long, and does put you in contact with all of the people who are immediately marginal and who tell you this is the experience of their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their, you know, and so it's a long experience of the failures of the state to protect you. And, you know, I think that that's really important. I would say that there is, this is back to, I think, Julianne's question about, is there a difference then between policing in Russia and the policing that's happening in other countries? This is policing in Russia these days post-socialist or global, to read back your question. So policing in Russia, I think, is a model. It's always been an example. The most famous case of this probably is the Protocols of Zion, right? Written by the Tsarist police and then disseminated across the globe, and used as a way of policing ethnic minorities, of terrorizing and oppressing them. And I think ever since then, there's been this kind of scenario of Russian state violence as serving a sort of model. This is why I think the example of Russia is so important for white supremacists who are all about, US white supremacists, international white supremacists who are all about policing, well, I guess like privilege access, right? Making sure that there is a class system. And they see this as part of, you know, they see this as really important to the very kind of idea of white supremacy. Is this policing in Russia often serves as an example for that. So I think, like, you know, if anything, it's things like Trump learning from certain things from Putin, right? That's even up to borrowing types of like ways of policing from Putin. Like remember the discussion of little green men dispatched in to police anti-brutality protests in the US, many people recalling the little green men that Putin sent to Ukraine, and then now talking about these unmarked vans and hyper militarized police from, you know, who knows what agency sent in to police protesters all over the United States. So it's not just the media discourse. I think this is a really very real sort of process of learning and of Russia serving as a model, actually, of policing to the you know, capitalist world.
The thing about the younger generation of activists and artists, I just want to point out that, or argue that, the millennial left didn't invent organizing as opposed to complaining. There's a general, I think what happens is that organizers, as they get older, shift to complaining. And what we're seeing is a very old story of one generation dissatisfied with what the previous generation did, for good reason, but there's still a positionality that's kind of beyond this chain of the next generation being disgusted with the previous one for its failings as well.
Yeah, I mean, you see this the critique, I think, even of the like the self-aggrandizement of the 90s generation is already in the 90s generation art. Like Alexander Brenner talks about it in his you know, recent autobiographies, like, fuck these people, you know, they're just looking for their own, you know, their own fame. And so it's also always temporally part of, you know, part of the moment as well. It's not just like, I mean, it's used as a mode of like distinguishing movements and sort of historicizing them, but it's also always usually, you know, part of the self-critique of art, of the generation of artists themselves. We have just a few more minutes. Does anyone else want to have anything else they would like to talk about?
I think I somewhat addressed the anonymous question about how are the artists integrated into political movement to abolish the police. So to be clear, I don't think there is a police abolition social movement in Russia. I think lots of people talk about police abolition, especially in the, I guess, sort of radical or even liberal circles, but there aren't police abolition sort of public, there isn't like public processing of that the way that there is newly, I think, in the contemporary discourse. So, you know, today in the US, like the police abolition discussion is often linked to the discussion of slavery abolition, right? Like the historical, there's a connection to be made there. And somehow I don't think that these kinds of discussions are possible right now in Russia, but absolutely these artists simply are all organizers, the people that I am talking about, and I think this is important. I also think that sometimes it makes it hard, frankly, to talk to them. So it is kind of an expectation at this point of those circles that you be an organizer. You're not just making art and getting awards and exhibiting in galleries, but you actually are doing something. And they expect the same thing of scholars who are obviously among them. Lots of this kind of activism lives in universities. That's partly why they even have access to this topic of police abolition. But I mean, simply police brutality is part of so many social movements, the experiences of social movements, that they have to talk about police brutality because they are part of whatever it is, eco-socialist activism or local kind of ZKH activism. Yeah.
Well, are there any last parting thoughts? It's been such a pleasure. Thank you all for these really rich presentations and for the dialogue. We can keep continuing to talk. And thank you all for the participants for being here, to Faith for moderating, and Jessica and the New Bar staff for all of your help in setting this up.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Faith. Thanks, Leah.